Now let's take a closer look at some of the render view options that we have available to us here. Some things we've been changing on the Redshift ROP directly, but we really don't need to. For example, this is currently set to half resolution scale on the Redshift ROP here, so that'll half whatever's defined on the camera, and this is how it'll be rendered to disk. And it's really better to leave this alone. However you want this to be ultimately rendered when you hit that render to disk button. So I'm just going to turn off override camera resolution. And of course I'm going to make sure that that's set to 1080, which it is. And of course this is going to slow down our render quite a bit. And there's this drop down here in the render view that says original size. And this drop down box here defines the resolution that will be rendered in the render view here. So if we want to do half resolution renders, we can set this to a fixed scaling. And that's going to default to 100, so this is still rendering 1080, but we can set this to 50% here, so that all of our test renders are done at half res, but we're not messing up our render settings on the Redshift ROP that we're ultimately going to use when we render to disk. So this percentage here is the resolution we're rendering, and this here is just the current amount of zoom relative to the original render size that this has rendered. So right now we're rendering 50% resolution and blowing that up 200% just for viewing purposes. Now we already talked a bit about the snapshots and how to take those. There's not too much to say there. And these select object and select material buttons I've actually never messed with. But if you click select material, and then we select something from our render view here. When we click on that, that actually brings us to the material on the object that we clicked on in the render view. So I clicked on the environment, so that brings us to our environment shader here. So that's kind of a handy way of, just visually selecting things that you want to edit in the node view here. So that's pretty cool. And then similarly, we have this select object button. So if we select that and click on the creature, that's going to jump over to our render creatures here and select that object. This click to focus will allow you to set the focus distance. I'm not really messing with depth of field here. And rendering with depth of field can look quite nice, or you could just apply that in compositing with a Z depth pass. It's kind of up to you, but you can certainly feel free to play with that if you'd like. If you turn on isolate selected, that will render only whatever object we have selected in Houdini here, so that could be handy as well for quickly focusing in on objects you're trying to tweak. And this button is interesting. This is a render mode that gives you a couple different diagnostic renders. If you click that, this will do a clay render. If you hit this little arrow here, that also gives you the option of viewing the samples. And these are pretty interesting options. This will show you how intensely it's sampling different areas of your scene. I don't find myself messing with this very much, at least I haven't on this project. But if you really want to get deeper into, fine-tuning exactly what your render's doing, you may find that helpful. This freeze tessellation button here, we probably won't really need to use for this scene. Certain processes require tessellating the geometry, like I believe this is required for displacement and perhaps some other processes. And this will prevent that retessellation every time that this render view is updating. So in some cases, you can get much faster responsiveness out of your IPR renders by turning that on if you're running into tessellation slowness. Now this button here switches between progressive rendering, where it's sampling the entire image all at once and it starts out pretty rough and just gradually increases the quality due to more and more sampling, versus this bucket mode here, which will render just one portion of the frame at a time. And either progressive mode or bucket mode are fine. There are a couple things to watch out for though. I believe the AOVs are only visible when you're rendering in bucket mode, but I will double check that once we get into the video covering AOVs, just to make sure that's correct. Now this drop down here allows us to render from different cameras, which is better than changing the render camera and the redshift ROP if you just want to use different test cameras while working on your scene here. And when you set this to a specific camera, you can hit this little lock icon here to freeze that camera so that it doesn't update when you're doing things in the viewport. The lock icon next to the camera drop down will enable you to freeze this with a consistent view. Although this looks a little bit weird here, we saw that in a previous video where changing the camera did not give us the same resolution here. So to avoid that problem, we can just go back to our cameras at the object level and make sure those are rendering at the same resolution. So on that test camera, I'll change that to 1080, so we shouldn't run into this weird problem anymore. And this render region button here I mentioned briefly before, that will allow us to pick a specific area of the render to focus on so we don't have to re-render everything. So we can shift and left click and drag to select the area that we want to focus our rendering on. Pretty straightforward. This button here will show the output before denoising, which for our purposes isn't really doing anything. I didn't bother using any denoising for this project. Perhaps I could have gotten away with lower render times if I just rendered with lesser sampling and used some denoising on it, but I do get paranoid about denoising potentially ruining some of the detail in an image. So if you have time, I would encourage you to experiment with and without denoising on your renders to see what the impact is on render time versus detail preservation and etc. This drop down will show us all of our color channels. We have our standard RGB alpha, and this is only going to give us our standard color channels. Any custom AOVs that you want to look at will be in this drop down here. And then finally these buttons over here will just start our IPR render, and this will force a refresh of that, whereas the first button will just do a static render as opposed to an IPR render that's looking for updates in the scene. Now going back to the other side here on our gear icon to open up the various settings. We already looked at a bunch of this when we were talking about color management with our ACES setup. This is also where you have control over your denoising settings and a bunch of other post effects and such. And for this project, I used bloom and flare and the redshift renders here. And although you can do some of this stuff in compositing instead, I actually quite liked the bloom and flare that I was getting in redshift here. So for my final renders, I used these post effects directly from redshift as opposed to compositing those in afterwards. So you can tweak those to your liking, of course. And we can use our AOVs to get a clean beauty render without these extra post effects so that we have some more flexibility in compositing. And I'll talk about that a bit more once we get into the AOVs. The photographic exposure can look pretty nice as well, but I prefer to do this in compositing instead of redshift. That sort of standard color correction is better done there in my opinion, and Fusion and Nuke actually have redshift photographic exposure nodes available, which I believe are third-party nodes in both cases that you can use to mimic the effects of the redshift photographic exposure in the compositing stage instead. The color controls here I don't really mess with, and I don't typically mess with the LUT setting either. If you really want to get in there and display some pixel data and do some color sampling and checking, you can go to the Pixel tab here and investigate all of the color data in your scene. And that covers most of the options we're interested in the UI here. If you hit this bar on the bottom, this will bring up some more information about your render. We talked about this very briefly before. You can open up your render log here. You have preferences to control the level of logging and everything else. You have some statistics here to show what your various render resources are consumed by in the scene. And this might help you to decide where you may need to make some optimizations if something is getting terribly heavy and difficult to handle. But I didn't really find myself needing to do any hardcore debugging with this information with any of the Redshift renders that I've been doing so far. So this is interesting info, but I don't feel like you have to obsess over it too much. And then looking at the menus quickly, not too much to say about the file options. View stuff is pretty self-explanatory as well. The preferences menu I haven't really found myself messing with too much either. And the most interesting of these menus here is the Houdini one, which allows us to select different ROPs in our scene to render once we have more than one of those in here. And we have camera refresh modes so that this will tell the render view which camera changes from Houdini's viewport to pick up. You can tell it to only update the IPR render based on the current ROP camera or any camera at all or any perspective viewport. The Pick ROP node will select our Redshift ROP just as a matter of convenience. Same thing with the Pick Camera node. And this ROP selector auto rendering option here will, as you might guess, determine whether or not ROPs will automatically render when you select them. So if we create a new Redshift render ROP here, we've got ROP 1 and ROP 2. If I turn that off, then when I select ROP 2, that's not going to render automatically. Let's go back to ROP 1, and then if I turn that option back on and switch over to ROP 2, then this is going to re-render using that new Redshift ROP. And this always on top, maybe I'm misunderstanding what that's actually doing, but it seems like the render view always wants to be on top regardless. So I'm not sure if that makes a difference or if I'm just missing something entirely there. And actually, after restarting Houdini, it looks like I do now have control over whether the render view is always on top or not. So you may just need to restart Houdini for that setting to take effect. So we've covered everything in this render view pretty thoroughly. Actually, there's one thing that we haven't talked about. That was the other resolution rendering options under this drop down here. For our purposes, it really only makes sense to render either original size or fixed scaling. The fit window and fill window will change your actual render resolution to either keep the aspect ratio and render whatever resolution fits within this window size here. So if we make this really tiny, then it's going to render a pretty small resolution. Whereas if we go to the fill option, this will render whatever aspect ratio our render view window is. So we're no longer rendering in standard, HD aspect ratio resolution here. So perhaps if you're doing some work for some other format that's not, limited to a very specific camera ratio, then those things might be helpful. But for standard VFX purposes, it seems to make more sense to either stick with original size or that fixed scaling. Now this render view is also available as a pane inside Houdini here. So if you go to the plus, go to new pane tab type, and you have the Redshift render view available here. And this is exactly the same thing, just docked inside Houdini. So it's just up to you, whichever way you prefer to work. And we also have a pane for the Redshift render info as well that we looked at before. And this looks pretty messed up from the UI scale that I used during screen capturing, but this should look a bit nicer for you when you have a more reasonable UI scale set. Now, I'm going to finish up this video by showing you one more thing that you can do to improve your render view workflow. And one thing that's always annoyed me about this render view button on the shelf here is that when you click it, it will automatically start rendering one of your ROPs. And this isn't necessarily a big problem if you only have one in your scene, or if it happens to pick the ROP that you're currently working on. But as you'll see as we get further into the class, we're going to have a whole bunch of Redshift ROPs set up for different layers, and I find this really frustrating when it tries to initially render my entire scene before I get the chance to pick a different ROP that I want to work on. And as far as I know, none of the settings that are available in the render view will prevent this from automatically rendering. This ROP selector auto rendering you might think would do the trick, but that only prevents rendering of a ROP when it's selected in the list here. But thankfully we do have a workaround to prevent this from rendering immediately. And for this, we'll have to close down Houdini and then open up our houdini.env. And I've commented out this environment variable here so that I could illustrate the problem. There's this environment variable redshift rv open only. And if you define this and set it to 1, then that'll prevent that problem where it immediately starts rendering. And just in case you're not very familiar with editing these environment variables in general, you can comment out lines so they're not included by putting the pound or hash symbol in front of the line, which I just learned is technically called an octothorpe. Didn't know that before. But yeah, if we get rid of this comment here so that we have that environment variable specified, and then we can reopen Houdini and reopen our scene here. Now if we go back to our Redshift shelf and hit that render view button, then you'll see that this brings up the render view, but it's no longer automatically rendering anything, so that we have the chance to pick whatever ROP we want to work on before this starts trying to render something. Maybe they'll make this a selectable option in the future, but I'm pretty sure that as of right now, editing that environment variable is the only way to do this.